Hey, how you doing? My name is Ryan, and today I'm finding out which of the LEGO Iron Man suits are the best and which are the worst. I'm looking at over 40 figures, from the Mark 1 to Mark 85, to the comic versions, to the War Machine variations, to the rescue suits. If it's a suit made by Tony Stark, it's up for a ranking on my tier list. So let's get started with the numbered suits and the Mark 1. This has an incredible torso depicting layers of armor plating that go into this suit. The added grime detailing across the paint really sell that this was built
in a cave with a bunch of scrap!
Also, the Mark 1 perfectly utilizes the static helmet mold to emphasize its low techiness. A lot of these suits will try and fail with various helmet molds, and I think this one perfectly matches the mold to the character. And I think the Mark 1 is easily an S tier figure. But how about the Mark 2? Now technically, this is a comic figure, but the LEGO Marvel Visual Dictionary labels this figure as specifically the Mark II. And I'm okay with that, as this figure looks very close to the silver prototype from the movie. The design is a touch simple, with basic armor plating on the torso and legs, but that helmet really holds this figure back. And just a heads up, this won't be the only time I say that in this video. The lack of mobility forced the designers to print the face, and the proportions just don't look that great. The mouth looks too small, causing Iron Man to look like he's chewing food. I think the Mark II ends up in the B tier for a less than stellar helmet. But how about the Mark III? This suit from Iron Man 1 was included in one of the first sets in the Infinity Saga wave, and I think the Mark III suit takes full advantage of LEGO's modern complexity in design. The shading and line work on the torso are handled very well, and the leg printing adds the golden accents adeptly. Now, very important before I rank this figure, there are two versions of it, with the main difference being the helmet. The first iteration, released in the Ironmonger set, uses the old helmet, while the figure from the Armory uses the new helmet mold with added printing. For the Mark III, I think I like the older mask. It feels more authentic to the bulkier Iron Man suits. This is, after all, his third suit ever. It's not going to be that slim. And the printing on the new mask makes the face feel just that, too slim, too slender. So the old helmet goes to the S tier, and the remake goes to the A tier, as it's not like the new helmet is bad, just not as good. Moving on to the Mark V from Iron Man 2. There are some great geometric design accents happening on the torso and legs, which beautifully depict the puzzle piece way the Mark V constructs itself. The patterning is really nice, but I'm not sure it works so well on the helmet. The line width of the accents on the face shield are rather thick, even though the helmet in the film has no visible seams. It's a small gripe, but it makes a difference for me, as these lines I think pull focus away from the rest of the figure. The other downside is the lack of shading across the armor design, which makes the torso feel flat. There's only a slight shadow rim around the arc reactor, so I think the Mark V ends up in the B tier, middle of the pack. How about the Mark VI, the original version? One of the first official Iron Man figures had a lot to accomplish. Not only did it have to depict Tony's armor and make it visually simple to scale down on a minifigure, but it also had to find a new way to depict that iconic armor helmet. Unfortunately for this figure, that's kind of where all the effort went. The rest of the design is rather flat and simple, nothing on the hips or feet, but the simplicity of this figure is honestly a good thing for collectors and fans, as it shows that LEGO wants to consistently improve the design and complexity of their minifigures. Is the suit bad? No, just kind of outdated. I think it's a C tier. Now, the Mark VI was redone in a damaged state for the 2023 Avengers Tower set, and this design is not only consistent with the original Mark VI figure, but the added shading, highlights, gold printing, and for the first time ever battle damage really elevate this suit. The silver accents are wonderful, and the mask is probably the best case scenario of the new printed helmet mold. The proportions on the face are fantastic, and the eye scratch is just terrific. This is a figure worthy of being exclusive to a $500 LEGO set. It's fantastic all around, and easily an S tier LEGO Iron Man figure. How about the Mark VII from 2012? For the older, simpler designs, this is rather clean. It's still flat looking with no shadows or highlights, but the increased amounts of gold on the torso help balance out the color. Again, I think this figure is fine for its age, if not good for its age, but nowadays, it's kind of outdated. But I think it belongs in the B tier. The Mark 7 also received a remake in 2023 with the Avengers Quinjet set, and much like the Mark 6, the Mark 7's glow up is incredible. The shading and highlights are great, the added bits of silver at the top of the torso I think are rather tasteful, the increased amount of silver on the legs are phenomenal, the proportions of the printing on the mask are perfect, not too thin, not too thick. This is an incredible figure, and it's great to see LEGO make their top tier Iron Man figures as recently as 2023, a great sign for the future of LEGO Marvel as a brand, and I think this figure is an S tier. The next figure to be ranked is the Mark 17 from Iron Man 3. The thick black line weight and lack of shading on the torso and legs really make this suit feel cartoonish. The dark blue I'm not sure has enough contrast with the dark gray to stand out as a complementary color. The multicolored helmet mold is a cool idea, but the paint constantly chips off this piece. If you look on Bricklink, a lot of sellers will be having their Iron Man figure noted as saying some of the paint has chipped off the helmet. And I think the Mark 17 belongs in the C tier. How about the Mark 22, also known as Blazer? Now, despite this being a comic suit, the Visual Dictionary says this is officially the Mark 22. And I would be okay with that if this suit's aesthetic wasn't so far off from all the other movie Iron Man suits. Frankly, this figure looks kinda goofy with the flame decals on the legs. The torso looks fine but feels a bit bland. There are ways to do monochromatic suits, and some of the other figures on this list do it perfectly, but this just isn't it for me. The helmet does not help at all, as it looks way off. The non-moving mask is usually a mistake for Iron Man, and here is no exception. I think Blazer, the Mark 22, ends up in the D tier. How about the Mark 25 from the Iron Man Armory? I have a theory, well, it's more so a conspiracy theory, that this figure was not supposed to be an Iron Man suit when it was first designed. Cover the helmet and it looks nothing like a Tony Stark suit. There's no typical arc reactor shape, and lacking that critical design element makes this torso feel like a generic armor suit or a spacesuit. The mask is fine, but it feels too slim and misshapen. And the bright yellow shoulder pads look more like pool floaties than any sort of armor. So I think the Mark 25 is a D tier Iron Man suit. But how about the Mark 30, also known as Taser? Again, this is another comic book figure made official by Wishing on a Star, and again I think it looks way too goofy to fit into the pantheon of LEGO Iron Man suits from the MCU. The Mark 30 is just kinda bland despite the different color palette. The lacking shading and highlights on the torso is incredibly frustrating, the mask print is boring, the added shoulder pads are really odd here. I'm just not a fan of this figure, and I think the Mark 30 is another D tier figure. Moving on to one of the more rare LEGO Iron Man suits, the Mark 33, otherwise known as the Silver Centurion. I still don't really like the shoulder pads, but the addition of extra bulk armor kinda justifies its existence here. The dual molded arms are nice to have, as is the tile printing on the front of the chest. The designers knew that a good bulk of this figure's printing would be covered up by that armor piece, so it's nice that they were able to condense their design effort onto that tile piece, the legs, and the helmet. Everything here is solid. Not great, not bad, and if that doesn't scream B tier, I don't know what will. And if you don't like that ranking, I'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below, as some of these can get pretty controversial. How about our next figure, the Mark 41? This is the first suit in the numbered series that is way overly complicated in design. The gold webbing is too omnipresent and overwhelming that it makes the black torso seem brighter. The legs are a bit more balanced, and the black lines on the helmet rarely look good, and spoiler alert, this is not one of those cases for me. I think it looks way too distracting and fragments the masks into segments rather than making it look like one cohesive piece with accent lines. So I think the Mark 41 is a C tier figure. Up next is another Iron Man 3 suit, the Mark 42. And we have another kind of flat gold design. There's no shading, there's no highlights, just a bunch of gold strips with a nonsensical leg design. And I should warn you, a lot of these Phase 2 suits I don't happen to like that much. So with that in mind, I think the Mark 42 belongs in the C tier. Moving on to Age of Ultron's Mark 43. This is a step up from the 42 as the balance of color is much better here. The gold works well as an accent, but the gray tubing seems a bit odd. However, the leg design does flow well from the torso, and this is one of those times where the black lines on the helmet work for me. They're subtle, thin accents that don't detract from the front and the overall design, so I think the Mark 43 belongs in the B tier. Pretty solid. But how about another Iron Man Mark 43? This was the expensive version of the suit included in the UCS Hulkbuster set. The first one, not the second one. It is sad that I have to specify that. And you would hope the expensive version looks better than the cheaper one, and it does. The visible innards on the top are really clean and crisp, the print quality on the lower design is impeccable, and the revised leg patterning is a noticeable improvement over the cheaper version. So I think the Mark 43 ends up in the A tier. Next up is the Mark 45, again from Age of Ultron. The eyes are oddly slim on this helmet, and the thick outline around the eye pattern does not help that. The overall design on the torso is kind of muddy, with minimal highlights not really popping. Also, the design on the torso doesn't really mesh with the design on the legs. There's just no real focal point on this figure, so it's hard to visually move through this armor. So because of that, I think the Mark 45 ends up in the C tier. How about Tony Stark's armor from Civil War, the Mark 46? The blue dots do draw your eyes away from the more barren midsection, and that's an interesting concept, having the sides of the armor be the focal point over the center. And I think it half works. There's some shading on this figure, but not so much on the edges, more so in the center. And the legs are indistinguishable from any of the other suits in the 40s, so I think the Mark 46 has earned a spot in the B tier. Next on the list is the Mark 47 from Spider-Man Homecoming. And finally, we have some color variants that works in making the suit look unique, but not goofy. The silver bottom has shading and undertones of dark gray with gold and blue accents. The legs are unique and fit the aesthetic of the Mark 47 torso. The dark gray hands work as they're grounded in the established main color palette. There is a lot working on this figure, and I think it belongs comfortably in the A tier. But how about some of the more modern Iron Man suits? The Mark 50 from Infinity War. This has an incredibly sleek torso print which matches the more stylish design of the nanotech suit. There's great shaping, great shading, and highlights. I love the accents on the hips and legs that flow incredibly well from the torso, but I think the older helmet design detracts from this figure's overall aesthetic. The original helmet feels too bulky for this newer suit design and makes it feel out of place, almost like it's on the wrong suit. And with that discongruity, we lose a cohesive design here, so I think because of that, this Mark 50 belongs in the B tier. Now, the Mark 50 was remade for the Sanctum Sanctorum modular, and even though the design is very minimally changed, it is different and a touch more refined. There's some great shading at play here. It looks like this figure has thinner outlines on the torso to have the elements blend a bit more, but the biggest change is the use of the new helmet with printing on it, which is much better, as I think it matches the overall sleekness of the nanotech suit. And we have a solid print on the mask, even if the face is a touch slim in my opinion, but I think this Mark 50 is an A tier minifigure. But how about the Mark 64, the figure included in the LEGO Marvel Visual Dictionary? Bricklink lists this as the Mark 64 suit, even though I haven't seen that listed really anywhere else. Either way, I really couldn't get a read on this figure easily. The black is supposed to be underneath the red armor, but it pulls so much focus from the outer shell and takes up so much space. Also, the additional gold accents, the brightest color on the armor, on the darkest section muddle the illusion a bit. I do quite like the mask, as the face looks kind of ferocious. It's one of the few times that a mean-looking Iron Man suit kind of works for me. But the legs have a strange pattern on them that looks like additional faces on the knees. Just kind of a weird touch there. I think the Mark 64 is a B tier suit. Now how about the Quantum Realm suit from Endgame? Look, this is barely an Iron Man suit. It's an Avengers figure with an Iron Man mask on it. I shouldn't really count it, but I kind of have to include it for completeness sake, and if I'm grading this on how it is as an Iron Man suit figure, yeah, it's pretty terrible. I think the Quantum suit belongs in the D tier. How about the Mark 85 from Avengers Endgame? This looks rather similar to the Mark 50, but with a greater gold presence. I do like the colored arms as it provides a nice contrast to the predominantly red torso. The shadow and highlights are good, as is the leg print. Now, as with the Mark III, there are two different versions of this suit with two different helmets, old and new. And I think this is the inverse of the Mark III in that the old helmet doesn't look as good as the new one. A suit from this late in Tony's life should be as sleek as possible, and the Mark 85 should be the most pristine and refined. The older helmet mold has its place in LEGO Iron Man history, just not here. So because of that, I think the Mark 85 with the old helmet belongs in the B tier, and the Mark 85 with the new helmet belongs in the A tier. But now we get to rank some of the more creative Iron Man suits as we're leaving the MCU and entering the world of comics, starting off with the Space Iron Man suit. This is one of my favorite comic book suit variations, and this is a masterclass of how a white Iron Man suit should look like. The balance of gold, white, gray, and blue is handled well, and the white helmet mold looks fantastic. And as a fan of the character and becoming a greater fan of the comics, it's great to see LEGO take a step forward in making a superior Iron Man figure suit. So I think the space suit belongs in the A tier. How about a figure that I have in my notes as, quote, the weird one from the 4+ Hulkbuster set? And as the name implies, this one's kinda weird. The torso is lacking the sharpness that some of the more modern Iron Man suits have, and the whole thing feels oddly smooth. The non-moving helmet doesn't help either, although I do appreciate the shading and dimension on the leg print though. I'm not sure what suit variation this is trying to adapt, if it's trying to adapt any, and if you know, drop a comment down below. But for my money's worth, I think the 4+ Hulkbuster figure belongs in the C tier. Next up is the Pearl Gold mech suit figure from one of the many Iron Man mech suits. And let me just say, it's amazing how much a helmet can detract from an overall figure. The torso and legs look solid, if not a bit flat. The blank arc reactor feels like a mistake instead of an artistic choice, but man, that mask, it's static, way out of proportion, making the head feel squished with way too much red on the chin, and it's really a darn shame because this figure could have been great. But for what we got, I think it belongs in the C tier. Next up is the Scuba Iron Man suit. Bulky for sure, but the printed arc reactor piece and the design under the armor is quite nice. The rivets on the rose gold face shield are wonderful, as is the sand green palette overall. I also don't mind the bulky armor. It's a personal taste. It doesn't always work, but here it's okay. So I think the scuba armor is a B tier LEGO Iron Man figure. Next up is the video game suit. I've always called this Walmart Iron Man. It's doing everything it should to look like an Iron Man suit, but just on a really low budget. There's minimal shading on the torso and a blank arc reactor, but the geometric layout of the design is nice. The face though looks off-brand. I'm not a fan of the thin eyes or the singular bold line mouth, and the helmet can't open either. I know there are a couple versions of Iron Man that have this exact face, but I was never a fan of that face to begin with. I think it looks too much like that C-3PO concept art and not Iron Man. So I think it belongs in the B tier. Next up, how about the Iron Venom transformation suit? And this is a great idea for a gimmick, and conceptually is phenomenal, but the execution kinda makes me feel like this was a figure with a really strict budget. The torso design and concept is pretty good, the half mask print is solid, but the blank legs, non-moving mask, and execution of the concept is lacking for me. Essentially, you're covering an okay figure with a lesser design, and removing some of that print in general is a downgrade for sure. So I think the Venom transformation suit is a C tier figure. Even worse so is the Iron Venom suit fully transformed. Take that last figure and do even less. A new helmet, but it's more boring than the mid-transformation version. So yeah, this one belongs in the D tier, bottom of the barrel. How about the Invincible Iron Man suit? I appreciate the effort to make a comic suit that's bright and bold and purposely cartoonish, but I do think you end up with a figure that looks flat, bland, and a little bit silly. The design of the mask with the center line, the thin lines, and no mouth is a huge mistake for me. Maybe I'm just so accustomed to just one look for Tony Stark, but it shows you how influential the film designs were and that it really has ingrained what this character should look like for a lot of people. So when you deviate from that path, even if it's with good intentions and comic precedent, it comes off looking kind of off. So I think the Invincible suit is a D tier figure. We have 2 more Iron Man suits left, and next up is the Toy Fair suit. And I really do appreciate the uniqueness of this prototype Iron Man, and judging by this figure, it's clear what needed to be improved before the official figure would come out later that year in 2012. Printed heads don't really work. Brighter hands for a darker suit don't really work. The torso is pretty simple, but only a touch less than the Mark 6 and 7 from 2012. And yeah, this is a collectible figure, but not for its design, only for its rarity. I gotta put the Toy Fair figure in the D tier. Probably the most expensive D tier figure you'll ever see. And one last Iron Man figure, the Mighty Micro. I just don't like this one, I'm sorry. It's silly and I get that's the point, but I just don't like the design. Visible teeth on an Iron Man suit just don't work for me. Mighty Micro's going in the D tier. But that's enough Tony Stark. How about some War Machine? Up first is the original. This is an excellent example of how to make a monochromatic figure. The various shades of gray are balanced perfectly, the shiny insignias and markings are fantastic details, as is the red rim around the arc reactor. War Machine's design speaks to military aesthetics, and when you can convey theme and story through elements of design, that's ideal. I think this figure belongs in the A tier. Now this figure was remade in 2023 for the Armory set, and unfortunately I think this figure is a step down. The base tone of dark gray leaves little room for highlights and shadows, but the red rim is nice, as is the design on the legs. The mask print is a bit squashed, but I love the addition of the red eyes. So I think the War Machine remake is a B tier minifigure. Next up is the Iron Patriot from his exclusive polybag. I love how this figure is literally the original War Machine design with a new paint job. The red, white, and blue look incredible on this figure with all the colors balanced and coherent. The dark red hands provide some needed contrast, and the star behind the arc reactor is such a brilliant touch. This figure is a masterclass on how coloring can change the figure so dramatically, and I think the Iron Patriot belongs in the A tier. Next is the War Machine suit from Civil War. Black is an interesting base color for War Machine, and certainly a risk trying to print lighter colors on top of black. The pattern is simple and the colors are blocky, but I think that had to happen to make them visible. The silver mask gives you at least some bright silver, but it is kind of an odd contrast having the color that silver should be on the mask against the color that it ended up being printed on black. So because of that discrepancy, I think this War Machine goes in the B tier. How about the War Machine from Infinity War? The benefits of being an exclusive figure as opposed to a retail figure. This Bricktober figure makes the same risk as the Civil War figure, printing silver on black, but because of the higher print quality, all the lighter colors pop wonderfully. The added red armor plates are a cool touch, and I like the extra mechanical pieces on the helmet print. This is one of those figures that's a bit harder to get, and I can see why. It's pretty darn good, and I think this Bricktober figure belongs in the A tier. Now how about the Quantum Realm suit from Endgame? Same as Tony, just a helmet on an Avengers suit. There are some okay elements like an okay Quantum suit, the added cannon to make this feel like War Machine, a good War Machine helmet, but they're combined in the worst possible way. And again, I think this Quantum Realm suit is a D tier figure. Next is the video game variant of War Machine. I've always been on the fence about this figure. It has some of the issues of the Civil War variant print-wise, but this figure uses silver outlines instead of a fill color to make the armor more readable and higher quality. So better torso and legs, but worse mask with a closed design and a squashed print. I think the video game variant goes in the B tier. One last War Machine figure, the most recent one from the 2024 mech suit. There is so much to like here. I love the design on the torso, the geometric shapes. I love the bit of shading just below the dark gray top bit that make it feel like it's layered on top of the silver ab pieces. This figure is one of the best at conveying depth that I've ever seen. The red arc reactor looks great, The silver plating on the legs look fantastic, the feet print looks great. I really love the light gray arms and dark gray hands as added contrast. It took a while, but I think we finally have our first War Machine figure that belongs in the S tier. We have 3 more Iron Man adjacent suits, and up next is the Iron Legion suit. And of course, Tony wouldn't give his best design to his automated drone suits. The blue and white are a cool color combo, but the red accents and logo look more like paint thrown on instead of intentional markings. The figure is fine, but nothing all that special. Textbook B tier. But how about the MCU Rescue Armor? This long-awaited Endgame figure is kinda disappointing. The gold claw-like markings are barely visible on the purple torso, and the mask just looks awkward and can't open, which is really odd as that's one of the most iconic moments with this armor, having the mask open up to reveal Pepper Potts. So the fact that you can't recreate it, really a letdown. The arc reactor is kinda swallowed by this design, leaving this figure with no focal point, and I think this rescue armor belongs in the C tier. And last but not least, the comic book version of the rescue armor, and this is much better. The coloring definitely plays a large role in making all the details more visible. The shading is clean and the silver is rather tasteful. But the biggest surprise here is the mask, and again, it's amazing how much the mask plays into the overall impact of the figure. This mask is probably the best version of the immovable mold, as the print proportions look perfect. The mouth is in the right spot, the eyes are small but not too thin, and it complements the overall suit. And I think this rescue comic armor goes in the A tier. And that's my ranking of all the LEGO Iron Man and Iron Man adjacent suits so far. I'd love to know what you guys think of my ranking in the comment section down below. Tell me what figures you think are S tier and what figures are D tier. And as always, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.